So in the last class we saw that Stephen explained the three qualities needed in art: integritas, consonantia, and claritas. And this is the core of the aesthetic theory, but actually something more preliminary to the aesthetic theory comes now when Stephen explains to Lynch the division into genres. The three divisions into the lyric, epic and dramatic forms. These are the basic forms of writing, and he explains them, or he defines them logically. What I have said, he began again, refers to beauty in the wider sense of the word, in the sense which the word has in the literary tradition. In the marketplace, it has another sense. When we speak of beauty in the second sense of the term, our judgment is influenced in the first place by the art itself and by the form of that art. So, when we think of beauty in artistic terms, then we think of its form also. The image, it is clear, must be set between the mind or senses of the artist himself and the mind or senses of others. So here comes the logic by which Stephen defines the form. The lyric, epic and dramatic forms, they are defined in terms of the place of the image, whether in immediacy or in a mediated relationship between the artist and the audience or the reader. If you bear this in memory, you will see that art necessarily divides itself into three forms, progressing from one to the next. So these three forms are not just three different kinds, but they are a gradual progression from simple to complex. So the most simple is the lyric form, next the epic form, and then the dramatic form. The dramatic form is the most complex. And why it is so, that is explained with the help of this relationship with the audience and the artist. These forms are the lyrical form, the form wherein the artist presents his image in immediate relation to himself. So the artist and the work of art. So there is an immediate relationship between the artist and the work of art. So immediate here is used in a technical sense, which means that there is no mediation. That is, the writer does not think about the audience or the reader at the time of writing. So the writer thinks about his own experiences, his subjective experiences, and gives expression to these experiences through art. Therefore, it is in immediate relationship to the artist. The next form, the epical form, the form wherein he presents his image in immediate relation to himself and to others. So you see the difference between the lyric form and the epic form. The lyric form, where the artist is speaking in the first person mostly and giving expression to his subjectivity in art, not taking into consideration the audience, because that he does not address the audience. So this is the immediate form without any mediation. It is the lyrical form, and it is the most simple because it does not take into consideration the third element in the triad of art, work of art, artist and the audience. So in the epical form, on the other hand, we see that it is a narration or a story where also the artist presents his image, but he places it in mediate relation to himself and to others. So the artist addresses also the audience here in the epical form and tells his story to the audience, and thus the narration or the epic has a mediated relationship where the artist's story is mediated through the audience or the reader. So the story is put in a relationship to the artist as well as the reader. Therefore, you see that in this conception of the epical form, Stephen imagines that there is a kind of exchange between the artist and the reader, because when the reader tells the story, he keeps in mind not only himself, that is his story, but also the reader or the audience. So that is the epical form, which is a little higher or a little more complex than the lyrical form. Now the epic derives from the lyric. If we look at the history of Greek and Roman literature, so the lyric verse is the primary form of verse, and then when this verse is extended over a longer span and also made to include a lot more experiences than the mere personal experience of the artist, then it becomes an epic. So an epic is in a way an extension of the lyric form, and it is also a little more complex because here the artist does not think only about himself or his story, but thinks also about the reader or the audience who is listening to his story or who is appreciating his story. The dramatic form, the form wherein he presents his image in immediate relation to others. So the dramatic form is in immediate relation to others. Why? Because in drama, the experience of the artist, if we assume that the artist imagines himself or presents himself through the image of the hero, then the experience of the artist is presented through direct speech. As in lyric poetry, the artist speaks in the first person, so direct speech. So in drama also the characters speak in direct speech, and we may imagine that all the characters in some way or other represent the artist's voice. So this direct speech is an immediate expression because it is not mediated through a narrative voice or a narrative technique. Therefore, drama is more complex or most complex, where the artist tries to present a direct experience directly through immediate speech to others, not to himself. So that is the difference between the lyric and the dramatic. In the lyric, the artist presents his experience to himself in an immediate relationship with himself. In drama, the artist presents his experience directly, but not to himself, but to others. So the dramatic form is the most complex, where the artist's voice represents the immediacy, the urgency of all the speeches in a direct fashion, and so it is the third most evolved form of art. So in this way, Stephen explains the three forms of art and presents a hierarchy among them, and thus it is also an important part of his aesthetic theory. Then he says that I keep a book at home where I have noted down many questions regarding art. For example, can excrement or a child or a louse be a work of art? If not, why not? So which things can be included in art, whether they can be included or they cannot be included. If they cannot be included, then why not, and so on. So in other words, an attempt to understand the limits of art. Excrement normally is uh, is kept out of art. Foul images or images of excrement and so on. But as I already told you that James Joyce in this novel as well as in Ulysses, in his other novels also, he presents all or a number of images which are normally kept out of an artistic work, like images of excrement or physiological activities which we normally do not express in civilized society, or urine, smell of urine and so on and so forth, dung, shit. So these images, I told you that they are found in Rabelais, for example, the French novelist. These are called scatological images. So including them in art means extending the boundary of art, because these images were cut out or eliminated from art by the romantics or even the classic poets, the romantic poets. Traditionally they always eliminated these images. Now by including them, Joyce extends the boundary of art. And child or a louse. Louse is similarly an image which we do not expect in an artistic work. But we find such images in extreme realistic art, for example, which is called naturalism. So the French novelist Émile Zola developed this kind of art, naturalism, which is an extreme realism or almost photographic realism, which does not eliminate any image even if it is not very noble. Lessing said Stephen should not have taken a group of statues to write of. The art being inferior does not present the forms I spoke of, distinguished clearly one from another. Lessing, the German writer who explains the classical statue of the Laocoon, where a number of people who are entwined by serpents and try to free themselves from the snakes. Lessing, by explaining that sculpture, tried to give an aesthetic or a romantic theory of art, and Stephen opposes that theory by saying that art is not so simple. So the art that Lessing speaks of is inferior because it does not present the forms or it does not distinguish between the forms of lyric, epic and dramatic. Now Stephen talks about the artist, that when an artist creates a developed form of art, then it becomes very complex. It does not remain personal any longer. The personality of the artist passes into the narration itself, flowing round and round the persons and the actions like a vital sea. So the artist may not be present in person as a character in his novel, but he is present everywhere, or we may say that his spirit is present everywhere. So here Stephen presents an image of the artist who is present everywhere but cannot be seen, who effaces himself completely out of art. Something which is said about Shakespeare, that Shakespeare completely effaces himself out of his art. We cannot see him, we cannot see Shakespeare the man in his art. So the world of art becomes something where the artist is all pervading. His consciousness, his spirit, or sometimes even his personality can be felt, but he cannot be identified, he cannot be seen. This idea Joyce takes from the French novelist Flaubert, Gustave Flaubert. Uh, Stephen speaks about it a little later, more elaborately. So here he says that the artist seems to flow everywhere in his work like a vital sea. The important word is vital. That is the life, the spirit of the artist is present everywhere in his work. This progress you will see easily in that old English ballad Turpin Hero, which begins in the first person and ends in the third person. So this ancient ballad Turpin Hero, there the story begins in the third person and ends in the first person, which means that the artist is present, but he is not presented directly. We see here Joyce's consciousness about the fact that the narrative voice in a work of art may change in its orientation, that is the point of view. So the ballad which begins in first person later may change in third person, which means that it begins as a personal story, but then it becomes a universal story, and therefore it is presented in third person. This is quite interesting for this novel, because this novel has just an opposite narrative technique. That is, it begins in third person and ends in first person. So the entire novel is in third person, almost following the Flaubertian model, where the point of view is third person, but the narration gives an impression of the first person. We get an impression of Stephen's subjectivity. Even though the narration is in third person, we do not feel that we are not listening to Stephen's voice. We seem to be in the psyche, in the mind of Stephen, following his consciousness. So Joyce is able to do this by following Flaubert's model in Madame Bovary, where Flaubert writes in the third person but gives the impression of first person narrative of Madame Bovary. Now in this novel, which throughout the course of the novel, which is presented in third person narrative voice or point of view, at the end we see that there are journal entries, and there Stephen writes in the first person. Obviously, in a journal or a diary, everybody writes in the first person. Why it happens so? Why is it in this novel the opposite of what was there in Turpin Hero, for example? The reason is that here Joyce is presenting the development of Stephen's psyche. So as long as Stephen is not fully mature, he does not find his voice. So at the end of the novel he is fully mature, and therefore then he can write in the first person in his own voice. So the autobiographical element in the novel, which is all along present, the novel is autobiographical all along, yet it is not written in the first person. Only at the end the journal dottings are in the first person. So why does that happen? Because it is a Künstlerroman, or a kind of a Bildungsroman, where the growth of the psyche of the hero is represented. So as long as the hero does not become fully mature, his voice is not represented in the first person. The personality of the artist, at first a cry or a cadence or a mood, and then a fluid and lambent narrative, finally refines itself out of existence, impersonalizes itself, so to speak. The aesthetic image in the dramatic form is life purified in and reprojected from the human imagination. So the dramatic form is where the spirit or the life is represented directly but in a purified, refined manner. The mystery of aesthetic, like that of material creation, is accomplished. The artist, like the god of creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. So in these lines, Joyce presents the Flaubertian idea of the artist, who, like God, is a creator of his artwork. But as in this world, we can feel that the world is made by God, but we can never see him. He is invisible. Similarly, in his work of art, the artist remains invisible or becomes invisible, but omnipresent, and he is indifferent. So this is a projection of the idea that as God appears to be indifferent to this world, paring his fingernails is a metaphorical way of saying that one who is indifferent to what is happening around him pares his fingernails and does not care about anything else. So, as God appears to be indifferent to this world, similarly, the artist appears to be indifferent to his work. In other words, Joyce presents the idea through Stephen that the artist develops a distance from his work. So even though the artist presents his consciousness, his psyche, which can be seen to be all pervading in the work, yet he does not identify himself with the work. He becomes invisible or indifferent to his work. Then the discussion, the dialogue is interrupted. Stephen and Lynch, they see a number of students, and among them there is Emma Clary, Stephen's beloved, and Stephen begins to think about her. Then there is a break in the narration, and then Stephen falls asleep and he has a dream, but it is an erotic dream, which is also called a wet dream, and this is therefore represented metaphorically. Towards dawn he awoke. Oh, what sweet music! His soul was all dewy wet. Over his limbs in sleep pale cool waves of light had passed. He lay still, as if his soul lay amid cool waters, conscious of faint sweet music. His mind was waking slowly to a tremulous morning knowledge, a morning inspiration. So he is not awake. He is having a dream, but he is dreaming that he woke up, and this is a beautiful morning and a morning of inspiration. A spirit filled him, pure as the purest water, sweet as dew, moving as music. So this spirit is compared to water. Now we know that in Jung, water is the mother archetype, and it stands for creation. So wherever we see the image of water, for example in the Bible also we see in the book of Genesis that God's voice wanders on the surface of the waters. So this is therefore symbolically significant, standing for an inspiration for creation. But how faintly it was inbreathed, how passionlessly, as if the seraphim themselves were breathing upon him, seraphim, angels. His soul was waking slowly, fearing to awake wholly. It was the windless hour of dawn, when madness wakes and strange plants open to the light and the moth flies forth silently. So it is the moment of enchantment, and the emphasis is on the instant, this particular moment. The instant of inspiration seemed now to be reflected from all sides at once, from a multitude of cloudy circumstance of what had happened or of what might have happened, the instant flashed forth like a point of light, and now from cloud on cloud of vague circumstance, confused form was veiling softly its afterglow. Oh, in the virgin womb of the imagination, the Word was made flesh. Gabriel the seraph had come to the Virgin's chamber. An afterglow deepened within his spirit, whence the white flame had passed, deepening to a rose and ardent light. That rose and ardent light was a strange, wilful heart, strange that no man had known or would know, wilful from before the beginning of the world, and lured by that ardent rose-like glow, the choirs of the seraphim were falling from heaven. Now, in his dream, Stephen thinks of the Annunciation of Virgin Mary. When the moment described in the Bible, when Gabriel the archangel comes to inform Virgin Mary to tell her about her special pregnancy. The image of the pregnancy of Mary, we know that the birth of Jesus was by immaculate conception, that is, without having recourse to any sexual activity or any role of her husband. Mary was made pregnant immaculately. So this image of pregnant Mary is an image of creation. The inspiration in the sense, in the etymological sense, that is the spirit which goes within, enthusiasm, inspiration. So the Spirit of God went within Mary and made her pregnant. So this moment of inspiration which would lead to the creation or birth of Jesus is a parable for artistic creation or literary creation. So just like Virgin Mary was inspired by God, similarly an artist is inspired and gives birth to a work of art. And this image of the flame, the white flame deepening into a rose and ardent light, brings into mind the image of the rose as well as the image of the beatific vision, the white rose which turns into pink in Dante's Paradiso, the vision of God, the beatific vision. So here Joyce mentions Gabriel the seraphim, seraph is a kind of angel, but Gabriel is higher than that of a seraph. He is an archangel. So he is one of the principal angels of God. So while thinking of this, Stephen is creating a poem, Are You Not Weary of Ardent Ways, and so on. And lines of the poem gradually come to him. And he wakes up and he stretches his hand and looks for a pencil and paper. He does not find any paper, but he finds a cigarette packet and he writes down the lines with a pencil on the paper inside the cigarette packet. So this is how poets often write down whenever they come upon some lines which they believe to be inspired, and lest they forget later, they jot it down wherever they can. So this is realistic, but this is also a bit comic because it does not seem that Stephen is going to write a very great poem, but nevertheless he is represented here as one who believes in inspiration and quickly jots down whatever comes to his mind. Then there is some conversation between Stephen and Emma. It is not clear whether these conversations are real or only in Stephen's imagination, most probably in his imagination. So they meet and She was dancing towards him, and as she came, her eyes were a little averted, and a faint glow was on her cheek. As the pause in the chain of hands, her hand had lain in his an instant, a soft merchandise. So, for a moment, he held her hand. "You are a great stranger now," the girl says. "Yes, I was born to be a monk. I am afraid you are a heretic. Are you much afraid?" So, Stephen is thinking still, what would have happened if he became a monk. And then he imagines, or probably he has a conversation with Father Moran, one of the fathers of the church, and the father assures him that the church is coming round too, the work is going ahead there too. So the church is doing its work, so you need not worry about it. But Stephen is very critical of the church. He had done well to leave her, to flirt with her priest, to toy with the church, which was the scullery maid of Christendom. So this is an allusion to an earlier instance when Stephen was with his friend and they saw Emma Clary walking with a priest. And Stephen was inwardly very angry because Emma was walking with a priest who was to him appeared to be a very mediocre person, and that Emma would probably open her mind to that priest in confession, which Stephen resented. So here he says that I did well, that I let her go with the priest in an angry mood. And he thinks that the Irish church is the scullery maid of Christendom. So it is the most inferior church in the world. So if Emma wants to toy with that church, that is, she is not sincere either, serious about the church either, or about religion, but if she wants to hobnob with the church and the priest, let her do, and I will not interfere. So he is very angry. Rude, brutal anger routed the last lingering instant of ecstasy from his soul. And then he leaves the classroom. We are not told when he went to the classroom, but we are told that he had left the classroom in disdain. That was not wholly sincere, feeling that perhaps the secret of her race lay behind those dark eyes upon which her long lashes flung a quick shadow. So probably he is still thinking of Emma Clary, but it is difficult to be sure because he thinks of other girls also from time to time, or of the flower girl who approached him and so on. And he thinks of the Irish girls in general, because here he talks about her race. So the Irish race that leaves upon her eyes a long shadow. He had told himself bitterly as he walked through the streets that she was a figure of the womanhood of her country, a bat-like soul waking to the consciousness of itself in darkness and secrecy and loneliness, tarrying a while loveless and sinless with her mild lover and leaving him to whisper of innocent translations in the latticed ear of a priest. So probably he is still thinking of Emma. So the girl is compared to a bat-like soul. This is significant because the bat image by which Stephen identifies the Irish. Why a bat? Because a bat lives in a cloister or in a secret corner, in a dark corner, and here we have in the novel several images of girls in a dark corner, like the peasant girl who had invited Devin, Stephen's friend, and the girls waiting, like bats keep waiting, and a bat has wings, it also flies, but unlike birds, it cannot soar very high. Therefore, a bat is a symbol of mediocrity, a symbol of inferiority. So the Irish race are imagined by Stephen to be inferior. They can never soar very high in their thought or vision. A bat also cannot see, therefore it does not have any vision. So it is a very denigrating image. It is used here, particularly in contrast with the bird image, because the birds can fly and can escape the sordidness, the ugliness, but a bat cannot. And these girls, they confess to the priest, reference to the Roman Catholic practice of confession, and it appears that Stephen, does not like these people who think that by confessing to the priest they can purge themselves of their sins. A priested peasant with a brother a policeman in Dublin and a brother a potboy in Macallan, to him she would unveil her soul's shy nakedness. To one who was but schooled in the discharging of a formal rite, that is, Emma would rather express her mind to the priest during confession than to Stephen. So she is described as a priested peasant, is a peasant who is who has great faith in a priest. So the priest is only discharging a formal rite rather than to him, a priest of eternal imagination, transmuting the daily bread of experience into the radiant body of ever-living life. So Emma would rather confess to an ordinary priest, to a mediocre priest, than to Stephen. And Stephen styles himself as the priest of eternal imagination, because he is an artist, so he worships art, and therefore he is a priest of eternal imagination. So we see that in Stephen's psyche, art takes the place of religion, and what does he do? Transmutes the daily bread of experience into the radiant body of ever-living life. This is an image from the Eucharist. So as in the Eucharist, the priest transmutes the ordinary bread into the flesh of Jesus Christ, which stands for ever-living life, eternal life. Similarly, as an artist, Stephen thinks that he transmutes the ordinary world to something eternal, something more beautiful. 10 years before, then Stephen again remembers the meeting with Emma on the last tram. This incident is repeated again and again. So what is the purpose of repeating certain incidents again and again in the novel? To indicate the continuity of the consciousness of the protagonist. So by repeating these images and reading these, the reader becomes certain that it is the same person whose psyche is evolving over years and is presented in more and more mature form. So here Stephen remembers this event. 10 years before, she had worn her shawl cowl-wise about her head, sending sprays of her warm breath into the night air, trapping her foot upon the glassy road. It was the last tram. The lank brown horses knew it and shook their bells to the clear night in admonition. The conductor talked with the driver, both nodding often in the green light of the lamp. They stood on the steps of the tram, he on the upper, she on the lower. She came up to his step many times between their phrases and went down again, and once or twice remained beside him, forgetting to go down, and then went down. Let be, let be. So this memory is very fresh, even though he remembers it after 10 years. And it is described in realistic details, in great details. So it shows the importance of memory in this narrative. So let be means that Stephen accepted that experience as something perennial in his life. Then this poem, which Stephen had been composing right after the dream, it is in the form of a villanelle. A villanelle is a French form. In French poetry we find a villanelle. We have an image of swallows, and this image of the swallows is described quite in detail, but apparently Stephen immediately could not recognize or identify what birds were they. So he asked, what birds were they? He stood on the steps of the library to look at them, leaning wearily on his ash plant. They flew round and round the jutting shoulder of a house in Molesworth Street. The air of the late March evening made clear their flight, their dark, darting, quivering bodies flying clearly against the sky, as against a lymphan cloth of smoky, tenuous blue. So the sky is compared to a cloth of blue color, and the swallows are flying round and round. He watched their flight, bird after bird, a dark flash, a swerve, a flash again, a dart aside, a curve, a flutter of wings. He tried to count them before all their darting, quivering bodies passed. 6, 10, 11, and wondered were they odd or even in number. 12, 13, for 2 came wheeling down from the upper sky. They were flying high and low, but ever round and round in straight and curving lines, and ever flying from left to right, circling about a temple of air. So the swallow is another bird image. We know about the central importance of the bird image in this novel, and this image seamlessly blends with the Daedalus image, because Daedalus with his wings flies and provides Stephen with the inspiration of escaping from this sordid reality. Now the swallows, they appear to be going round and round, and their flights they seem to be strokes of inspiration, darting movements in different directions. So we may say that the image of the swallows is some kind of triumphal celebration of inspiration, because the movement of the swallows and their darting flight, they appear to represent sudden flashes of inspiration. That is, the language by which the flight of the swallows is described. It appears that the sudden movements of the swallows are compared to sudden flashes of inspiration. So Stephen wonders about these birds. A sense of fear of the unknown moved in the heart of his weariness, a fear of symbols and portents, of the hawk-like man whose name he bore, soaring out of his captivity on osier woven wings, of Thoth, the god of writers, writing with a reed upon a tablet and bearing on his narrow ibis head the cusped moon. So we had the allusion to Thoth in the bird girl image, the Norse god Thoth, who is the inventor of writing. He usually has an ibis head with the crescent moon on his antlers, on his horns. So the image of Daedalus, the hawk-like man flying, and with these images Stephen is filled with some kind of fear, because the images appear to be some portent of some threat or some danger. So we know that Daedalus could not ultimately, in spite of this technology, save his son Icarus, who flew too near the sun and who fell into the sea. The image of Thoth is also it also evokes fear. And what is this fear? This fear is associated with the image of the artist, because the artist acts alone. The artist invents new technology, but he acts alone, and this loneliness might lead him to horror or fear. Then the swallows come back. They came back with shrill cries over the jutting shoulder of the house, flying darkly against the fading air. What birds were they? He thought that they must be swallows who had come back from the south, Then he was going. Then he was to go away, for they were birds ever going away, and ever going and coming, building ever an unlasting home under the eaves of men's houses, and ever leaving the homes they had built to wander. So the swallows also symbolize exile, because the swallows, they build their homes near the homes of people, but then they leave, they go away to wander. Similarly, Stephen here feels that he also must leave, he also must go away into exile. So here Stephen is mentally preparing himself for leaving Dublin and leaving the country. Then there are a few lines from Yeats's poem, quotations. A soft liquid joy like the noise of many waters flowed over his memory, and he felt in his heart the soft peace of silent spaces of fading tenuous sky above the waters, of oceanic silence, of swallows flying through the sea dusk over the flowing waters. So you see here the use of the word many waters, which is used in this phrase is used in the translation of the passage from the book of Genesis, where the Spirit of God walks on the many waters of the oceans. And the image of this water, the soft liquid, it is compared to joy, that is the elation felt by Stephen. But this water image, as we already discussed, stands for creativity. Symbol of departure or of loneliness. Stephen thinks of augury, that is the interpretation of charms or interpretation of symbols. So by looking at birds in ancient civilization, one would interpret omens or sight of birds to stand for some coming danger. Then again he comes back to reality and the political actions, the comments by people who engage in politics, and Stephen's discussion or conversation with Cranley. Now Cranley is the friend who remains with Stephen till the last, but then Stephen also leaves him, which makes Cranley sad. When Stephen decides that he will go away, Cranley says that you are not thinking about any friend. So he thought that Stephen would also think about him. But Stephen even leaves Cranley, his dearest friend, and decides to go away. So we have more or less finished. After this there are not many passages to be explained, but the diary jottings, you read the diary jottings, and the last sentence of the novel, 27 April, old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good state. So the novel ends with Stephen invoking Daedalus as the old artificer or ancient artist. He should bless Stephen, or he should stand with him in his efforts of being an artist. Okay, so Stephen comes to a mental maturity and decides that his vocation will be that of an artist, and he goes away in exile, and this is how the novel ends. Alright, so we have finished it, and in the next class I will discuss the topics or questions.